Okay, hello and welcome everybody to our FarmQA webinar. And today we'll be speaking on reporting options. And so first of all, my name is Ben Munson. I'm a senior technology specialist with FarmQA, and I'll be walking you through today's webinar. As the title kind of implies, we're going to be focusing in on the reports that we can generate from FarmQA. And more specifically with that, we're going to walk through on the scouting functionality or module that we have. We're going to talk through how you can generate PDFs, Excel files, how you can then share that data to a grower. And more specifically within that, if we're talking about a PDF generated report, what layout options we offer and export options as well. And then with that, we'll also talk about kind of that same concept, but on the recommendation or chemical advice side of things. And then there's also ways we can combine both data sets into more of a rolled up report for that consumer to the grower. So that is the focus for today. I do get a lot of questions from our existing customers on how you can adjust our scouting forms to match an ideal layout that somebody has in their head. And so this webinar is kind of tailored to that, where we can hopefully outline some of the most common report types that people have or like from FarmQA. And I can show you how you can make certain adjustments to get to the ideal output that you may be looking for. So that's the goal for this particular webinar. And as always, please ask questions in the chat bar, and I will be addressing those at the end of the webinar. And so post those at any time. Don't feel like you're interrupting, and then I will address those as time allows at the end. So with that, we're going to jump right into the demonstration where I can show you some of the report types as shown on some of the screenshots here, as far as what we can do with the layout for both scouting recommendations and some of the other data in the platform. So with that, I'm going to jump over to our platform. And what you're seeing here, this is FarmQA Controller, or our web view. And I'm going to start out by pointing out a few settings that may come into play when you're thinking about setting up reports and getting them to look the way you want within the FarmQA system. So to do that, I'm going to go into our settings tab on the left-hand side of our web view. And in this particular scenario, I'm going to click on organization. And then you'll notice that we default you into this details tab. And what I wanted to point out from this particular screen is that we allow any user in the system to upload, sorry, I should say admin level users, to upload a logo into your FarmQA account. And the reason I'm bringing this up now is because this is going to be the logo that we will automatically display on your reports as they get generated. And I wanted to point out that you can customize, you can upload whatever layer or whatever icon or whatever logo you want into the system. So what I did there is I clicked on the edit icon, and I'll slow that down, but there's an edit icon right here, or a pencil. And if I click on that, that opens up a drop box where I can now click to search my computer. Or what I did is I actually located it first of all on my computer, and then I just dropped that in on the left-hand side. And as you saw initially, that would then upload the logo. We will start to use that on your reports, so that automatically gets stamped onto those PDFs when we're talking about what gets sent to the final consumer or user. So keep that in mind. And while we're here, I'll also point out some of the other settings that come into play when talking about reports. The first one is the merging of scouting reports on fields. What this function is it allows a user to set a time window for which they want automatic merging to happen. So for example, we have customers that go out with a kind of an army of scouts, or maybe 5, 6 scouts in a field, and they will collect data that they all want to merge back into a single report. That's a scenario where they would want to turn this on, but they could have a relatively short merge window. There's other scenarios where perhaps you might be an individual scout and you would turn this on to say, I just scouted, but then the next day you return, or 2 days later, you return to scout it again, and you want to keep that as kind of a report per week. You can then continue to build off the report throughout that particular week, and it's going to be stored as a single report, so a single PDF. Some of the other stuff we're going to leave for now, as it doesn't necessarily pertain to our conversation. On the advice side, one thing I will point out is that we did add in this function where you can put what we call boilerplate text. So if it's on recommendation, you could say something like, be sure to view all product labels before applying. And now whatever text you put in this box will appear on any recommendation that you generate to a PDF. So it's kind of a maybe a legal disclaimer, if you will, is a more common use for this. And we do have italics, kind of the standardized visualization or text manipulation tools within this box as well. And so just note, if you save this, the text in that box will then start to appear on the recommendations. So I will save that. Now we'll jump into some of the reporting. So what I want to point out now is that I have manipulated a few templates to mock up scenarios to show you in this webinar. And so just as a quick recap, to get to those templates for any user watching this video, you can click on the Settings tab on the left-hand side. Your templates are in the top left. And a common question I get asked is about layouts and question types. And so that's the first thing we're going to dive into here today. And I'm going to showcase this in a template I call template examples. And what I want to point out today is that if you look at different ways to set up question types, and so if I come into the template designer, in this case, I'm looking at diseases, but what I want to point out is we have question types as far as you can set up numeric, text, pick list, date, group, and some calculated type questions are the categories or the type of data that can be captured within our program. But depending on what type you select, that's going to look slightly different on the final report. And so if you're wondering about kind of doing a deeper dive on template setups, I do have a previous webinar I'd recommend watching on customizing scouting forms that will address this in more detail. Today, I'm just going to lightly go over this and talk about how this changes the layout specifically. And so keep that in mind, and you can rewatch that webinar if you want a deeper dive into this particular side of FarmQA. But with that said, what I've done in this case is I've picked on diseases and weeds. And a very common question I get asked is somebody who wants to do more of a high level, just a really quick assessment of diseases versus people that may want to drill into more detail and do, let's say, percent defoliation assessments and be tracking that. And so the reason I'm bringing that up is there's really a wide range of use cases that people are after when they come to us and look to use our platform. And what I would say is that we are very flexible in the sense that we can help somebody who wants to do a very high level assessment of a field versus if you really want to get into the details of capturing information at a very pin specific, detail specific level. So I'm going to show that in diseases and weeds. But what I have here is the first disease tab. I have my diseases listed out, and this is more of a simplified use case where it's going to be really quick to enter the data, but it's going to be a little bit bulky on the report side. And so what this is I have a question per disease, and then within here I can track kind of one entry per that disease, meaning that in this case I have tar spot set up as a numeric. I have, let's say, stock rot as a pick list, for example. And so within that, I would just be able to, let's say, stock rot, indicate if it's high, medium, low, or heavy. I wouldn't, for say, be able to say stock rot, it's low pressure, and the disease and the percent infestation is 90. In this scenario, I'm just doing a single assessment per disease. If you want more of that, the dual entry setup, there's kind of two ways to do that. And when I say dual entry, I mean for weeds or diseases, if you want to look at severity and height or severity and percent defoliation, those would be kind of a multi-answer question. So traditionally, this is how we had that type of scenario set up in FarmQA, where you had disease one is where you could pick your diseases, followed by severity. And then if you wanted to have a question below that, you could have disease one, percent defoliation, and then continue on to your other diseases. So you'd build up this list to accommodate that. Now, I would say this is likely going to become less common in our platform with the introduction of our group questions. And so this is the third report type or kind of data type that I would touch on when it comes to assessing disease, or any really insects, weeds would fall into this category as well. And this is where you can have a pick list followed by a series of sub questions, which can all be repeated by allowing this multiple answers in the scouting template. So keep this in mind. You can kind of replay this video when we post it as far as looking at those examples again. But now I'm going to show you how that looks on the data collection side, and then finally on a PDF as I fill out those 3 different categories. So with that, I'm going to jump over to the mobile application. I'm going to make a sync, and this is just pulling down the latest changes to that template. We do auto sync, but if you're making changes in real time, that's something that you would want to do. So if I zoom in, I'm going to pick on this field 166, and this would be an experience if I'm out in the field, I'm collecting data, and what I'll do in this case, I want to choose a template because I want to specifically use this template examples. So as I do that, this brings me into the form that I created, and I'll just put a summary in here so you can see what that looks like. So overall field looks good. But now as I go through these disease tabs, so if I have disease 1, you can see that this was my first scenario where I had kind of a single input per disease, and I could bounce through this fairly quick if I'm doing a tar spot assessment or looking at stalk rot as a pick list. But so I guess pros and cons to this one. This is very fast for data collection. The downsides would be, like I said, a single entry point per disease, meaning that you can't enter a severity and a height and a disease or a percent infestation. And then the second downside could potentially be how it looks on the PDF, depending on what you're after as a layout. The second option here is where we talk through if we've got a series of disease 1, so you just go through a pick list, give it a disease, a severity, and then move on to stalk rot, and then maybe give that a severity. So you can move through a series of pick lists to do it, and this could be set up as a multi-assessment question. And the pros and cons here, again, this is fairly fast. You would have a lot of questions as far as scrolling down if you start to get 6, 7 other diseases. This starts to get kind of longer to enter. And that's where kind of my suggestion of kind of maybe the best option if you want to do a multiple entry scenario is if I come into diseases here and I click on this question. Now this serves you up a series of sub questions where, as I keep talking about, we can track severity, damage, give this question some notes. But then within the repeater question, or the group question I should say, is that I can repeat this, and now I get served up a blank form that I could fill out again. And I'll do it a third time for the sake of the report. So this is probably the ideal scenario if you want to capture, like I'm showing here, a severity of damage, notes, all pertaining to one disease, insect, or weed. You can now thumb through this by using these up or these back arrows if you want to look through your answers. And if you click key back here, you'd also see the list of the diseases that you had found or tracked. So with that, those are the different types that I would the most common setups when it comes to capturing disease, insects, weed information. And to kind of summarize what I'm saying here is that I would recommend this group question is probably my primary recommendation for capturing data, unless you're going for a really quick, simplified, just tell me what's present here. And then I would go to more a series of back-to-back pick lists like this. But now I'll show you what this looks like on a PDF, so that would help also make your decisions when kind of digging into setting up your own templates. So my scenario here, I'm going to submit this report. And now what I'll do is I'll turn around and generate this. Actually, I'm going to look at it from the web view so you can see it from both that perspective and as a PDF. And so what we have here is if I jump into my scouting tab, sorry for jumping around on you. Now this is where I'm going to have the different layouts. So if we look on the left-hand column, the disease 1, 2, and 3 correspond to the different data collection methods. And as you can see here, disease in the first 2 scenarios, it creates an independent line for every disease that you found, followed by the captured information or the kind of the ranking. If you had in the second scenario, if you had disease 1, severity, and a height, you could do that broken down. But then again, the report does get fairly lengthy vertically. If you do that, if you would also have a height and a disease or percent defoliation. And then the third option, where it was that group question type setup, This is, I would say, the ideal output in the sense that it creates its own table with independent columns, which correspond to the multiple observations or multiple assessments per disease, insect, weed. So this is hopefully giving you an idea of the layout. And then finally, we'll go to the PDF of this information as well. And I should also point out that summary text, you can see how that shows at the top of the report as well. But now as I open up the PDF, something to note is that this looks fairly similar when we're talking about the PDF versus the web view. One difference here is that this is its own independent table that would float kind of at the bottom of the report if you do use that group question style setup. So anyway, this is going to be, that's kind of the core walkthrough here on the different data types and how they flow into the PDF. And again, I'd be happy to answer questions on this if anybody has anything in the chat. The next thing that I'll touch on is when talking about the scouting reports, we're going to dive into the PDF customization options. And so what I mean by that is within our program or within our platform, you can choose what you want this PDF to look like. And the way you do that is by expanding out this drop-down arrow from the web view. And then these are different options that you can customize that would change the output of the PDF. And so we'll talk through a couple of these options here, and I'll actually show you the PDF changes as we do this. These are also available on the mobile app. So I will just briefly show you how you can get to that same menu from the mobile app. If you click on a report, it pulls up a similar window. So these are all the same options we're showing in the web. So just note that you can customize the PDF layout, whether you're on the mobile app or if you're on the web view. And we do remember your preferences per device. And so if you, let's say you want the weather information in there, you can make that available. You can change the map types, but then those changes are just going to be remembered specific to the device that you're on when you make those changes. So with that said, we'll talk through these options. So the first one, it's the observations as rows. And this essentially pivots the X and Y axis on a report in a way that it will put the questions will become kind of the columns, and then the observations become the rows. And I'm going to show an example of that. We're going to kind of hold on that one before I show the PDF because I want to mock up kind of a second scenario for that. A few more things to talk through would be the map type. And so that would be this mini map that we show on the report. So if I pull up this particular PDF, let me get this set up the way I want it to look. So if I pull up this PDF on the left-hand side of my screen, the map would change, or the settings to change the map type would adjust that mini map. Sorry for jumping around on you guys here. So here's a PDF report I have up. And so if I were to adjust the map type, we have gray, terrain with labels, dark, light, road, and none. And so I would say the most common that people use would be the terrain with labels. Terrain meaning that it is that satellite background map, and the labels meaning road labels. The other options we have, some people do like the light if they really don't care about that spatial reference or that satellite reference. Otherwise, we do have people that don't want the map altogether. If it's a scenario where maybe you're working in really small vineyards, or we actually have people using us in greenhouses, that would clearly be a scenario where you could pull the map off altogether using that none option. The weather information, that's fairly straightforward in the sense that it's either included or not. And when we say weather information, it's going to be what you see in this box down on the bottom right. We stamp based on the completion time of your report. We're going to bring in weather data and stamp that or associate it to the scouting report. And so this is just choosing if you want that to appear on the PDF or not. So if I now generate this again, it should be the same report I have on the right-hand side, but this time it will include that scouting or the weather information. Let's see, it looks like it did not include that time. Let's see. Yeah, so we go to standardize, and that should stamp in. I'm not sure why that didn't work in that case. So anyway, we'll move on. That should work if you move that to standard. The header options, this is one thing where it's going to dictate what shows at like it implies on the header. And I've got a few different reports up, which will hopefully allow us to talk through these options. So as we look through here just briefly, the logo that I uploaded at the very start of this webinar, that's what we're going to be displaying when we say logo. And then with the name, that would be your enterprise name. So in my case, that would be a logo with Munson Farms, a logo with a farm dash field that would say, we'd have my Munson Farms logo, but then it would state Old McDonald Farm, field ABC. Logo only, that's pretty explanatory. The last two would not have any logos, and it would just list out Munson Farms, or it would list out Old McDonald with the ABC fields. And I have a series of reports up. Let's see if I can get them to display properly here. So this will hopefully showcase the different report headers. So what I have here is, this would be an example where I've got my logo with this would be the grower dash field name. And I would say this is probably the most common option that people do like, especially if your name of your company is in your logo. Otherwise, this would be logo only. These are those last two options where we're gonna strip out the logo and just put either your enterprise name or the farm dash field name. So you can kind of look through these options. I think I do have one more that got out of alignment, but this would be my logo dash enterprise name. So those are the different header options that we have available. And again, those preferences do get remembered. So it's not like you're going to have to be tweaking these constantly to get that report to work out the way you want. Orientation, portrait versus landscape, fairly straightforward. I'm going to show an example where I would say 90% of the time landscape is the best option, unless you have multiple observation reports where you've got more than 6 or 7 or 8 observation points in a field. That's where it makes more sense to flip to landscape. For anybody else, I would recommend portrait. Page size, where I get into conversations about page size is often about when people want to get all their content on one page. And letter, that's going to be your standard 8.5 by 11 piece of paper that can be printed out. The key thing that I would say here is that if your customer, if they want to physically print out a piece of paper, I would leave this as letter. I wouldn't touch it. If it's a scenario where someone's only going to be viewing a digital version of the report, so like I was doing here in the web browser, then I would be very much open to playing with these page sizes, because there's no implications of not being able to print, and you can get more content on a piece of paper if it's different size. So this is just kind of a general size chart that you could Google and find something like this, but this would explain kind of the breakdowns of a letter versus legal and some of those different descriptors in here. So keep that in mind, and that is a good kind of answer to the question of how do I get more information on a single page. The last thing is, if you want recommendations included, you can have them show up first, meaning before the scouting content, last, meaning below the scouting content, or not included at all. And if it's omitted, then you're just generating a scouting report with the recommendations cleaved off of it. The last option is pertaining to those recommendations. So if you are choosing to include those in a joint report, you can also be displaying the prices for that as well. So that's kind of a descriptor of those different options, and there's a lot of different levers and dials here, so I won't go through every report type itself. But a common scenario that I do want to talk about is, I would say very commonly, or I'd say if you're kind of in row crops and you're looking for a PDF that kind of hits a lot of the check boxes that people are looking for, I would have my settings like I see here: terrain with labels, weather information, that's up to the customer if you find value in that. Then I would say the logo with farm dash field, portrait, letter, and then recommendations last. So what I have on the screen, I would say is if you're just looking for how to start, these are my recommended options for your report. Now, a second scenario I want to talk through is we do have a fair number of customers working in, I would say, niche crops, whether it's wine grapes, hops, and you're doing more of a dense collection of data. That's one report type that I'm just going to point out and walk through how you can do more of a dense assessment and get that to look really clean on a PDF. And so I'm going to jump back over to our mobile application, and I actually have a scouting report in progress where I've started to mock up this scenario. What I have here is that if I click to add an observation, this is a report where I'm simply doing counts, whether it's insects, predators, diseases. And then I'm going to do this at a lot of different spots in the field. So maybe 10 to 20 assessments in a field with a team of scouts, maybe 3 or 4 scouts doing this collection. So you can see how you can quickly jump through here and enter that information. on what you find per pin, and these pins can be specific to your GPS location. But then what I'm doing within here is, let's say that this would be a combination of scouts. This could be 3 different scouts submitting this information. But as you can see, it is very dense, and I'm doing a lot of different counts in a field. And what I'll do here is now let's just say I want to submit this. I can now click this green check box and submit. And one thing I was doing there, you saw I had all my templates set up to have default zeros, so that if I didn't see, let's say, aphids, I'd still want to track those as a 0 because they weren't present in that particular case. And so what we'll do here is now if we go back into the report, that's the wrong one here. Let me give that a refresh. Or actually, I'll pull up on the PDF. So it's field 166. If I want to show, actually, let me make sure that didn't merge. Let's see. I think that did merge. Let me mock this up one more time. Sorry about that. I'm going to go into different field this time. Let's just say I'm going to go into, no, I'm sorry, this is the one I wanted. So it didn't merge. So this is what I was trying to show, a scenario where I've got a lot of pins, in this case 13 observation pins in a field. What you'll notice in this view is there's a lot of columns. Each one corresponds back to a pin. You can actually interact with these pins to show or highlight those sections that correspond back. So it more easily allows you to visually see where geospatially this data is captured. But you can also scroll through here. So that's where if we kind of expand beyond, I think it's 4 observations, we put this horizontal scrolling in for you. But in addition to that, I want to point out that we also automatically include this average column. So now at a glance, you can generally see how well this field is doing or how poorly. But then what I want to point out is this is a very different report type than what I just showed when we're talking about doing maybe a single observation summary. And so to make this look fairly clean on the PDF, what I would do is, in this case, this is where it makes sense to pivot that report where I want those observations to be rows. And then what we can do, well, I'll generate this both ways so you can see what it looks like. But then what you can do is we'll have the weather data off. I don't want my recommendations. And then this is kind of the scenario I was describing where landscape does make sense. So now if I generate that to a PDF, this would be my recommended settings if you have a scenario like this where it's a very dense collection of data in this way. So overloading, we're also going to talk about the combined view, but regardless, this is the kind of the output there where I've pivoted the data, where you can see now the questions are up top. If you like that breakdown to visually see, which pins had, let's just say, aphids, for example, with the average column at the bottom. But the other view, if I now just turn that off or I don't pivot, you can kind of see the differences here where I don't change or set those observations as rows. It'll now say, you can see that data horizontally. So again, it's about that pivot concept and how that works in there. Again, I would say portrait versus landscape, that's going to be around the 4 or 5 observation mark where that starts to look better. And then if it is very dense numeric like this, you can decide if you like that observations as rows or if you want to keep that pivoted with the questions as being on the rows themselves. Okay, hopefully that's making sense. This will obviously be posted so you can watch this again if you want to slow down and see what buttons I clicked in more detail. But the next thing that we're going to touch on is how we can now get the recommendations and get those to look the way you may want. And then we'll end up by looking at combined views. So on the recommendation side, so I'm going to pull up within our web view a chemical recommendation. And note that I can thumb through these, so I can quickly be seeing all my recommendations that I have written. You notice that boilerplate text is going to show up at the bottom, which I started the webinar out with. But now, if I click on this export option, similar to how we did scouting reports, I can expand out my options on the left-hand side. And within here, talking through the options, I will show in a PDF what it means to hide the per field totals. But essentially, it's if you want a very condensed report, put a lot of information on one page, you would want to hide those. Show prices is fairly self-explanatory. if you're tracking chemical prices in FarmQA, you can choose if you want the end user to see that data or not. The header options would be the same that we talked about on the scouting report. And so I'll leave those alone for now. The header style, this is one thing I will generate different options of, but again, it's about condensing reports or if you want to show full detail. And when I'm saying this, it's really a difference on if you're sending a report to, let's say, a spray applicator versus if you're sending it directly to a grower who's just going to look at it as more of a to-do list. And then again, at the bottom, we've got the orientation of portrait versus landscape, and then a page size selector as well. So talking through some of the most common report types, I'm going to show if you want, so this is a batch recommendation where if I back out, you can see I had 4 different cornfields that were all getting this combination of Everest and Explorer. So if I generate this to a PDF, well, it's just kind of our standardized output. I'll show you what this looks like. So this is going to be more of a detailed to-do list where you can see field by field. We've got the information as far as what chemicals, the rates. We automatically show you your product totals based on your field size. And so as you look through here, you'll see obviously the same rates, but unique product totals based on the size. And then at the very bottom, we show a roll-up total as well. So you can see here's the total chemical you need to spray those 4 cornfields. But then along with that, you get that boilerplate text at the bottom and along with some roll-up data as far as total water needed and acreage covered. So this is a nice clean kind of to-do list. I would send this to the applicator who's going to need to see those totals and the rates. Now, another scenario to talk through is if you want to provide more of a condensed report. And what I would recommend here is that I'm going to select multiple recommendations. In my case, if you look at fields, these are all batch recommendations, meaning that they all include multiple fields. So now if I generate the PDF, you can see these are the options that I had talked through before. But now with having multiple reports, I'm going to hide the per field totals, and then we actually get a new option that shows up. So you can choose to suppress page breaks if you have multiple recommendations, or to keep a natural break per page. So I'll show you that with that turned off. But now this is an option where, again, it's more of a condensed view, and you're going to get more information on a single report. In this case, excuse me, I chose to have my roll-up product totals at the top of the report. But then as I scroll through here, you can see how that header off information collapsed down. And now I just list out the fields. Here, this is a better example. So here's the 4 cornfields, but instead of showing the per field totals and the rates, I collapse that down and just show the rates at the bottom. So again, more of a roll-up summary view of saying, here's your corn recs, maybe your soybean recs, and your sugar beet recommendations all in one PDF. Now, a final view that we had been requested to generate is even more condensed than that. So if I now look at my header style, so in that past report that I just showed you, I collapsed the per field totals, but I still showed all the details, meaning the acreage, the weather conditions at time of application. But if I just want a common delimited list of fields, I can go to field names only, and I can also suppress page breaks. So this is going to be kind of a third use case here where if you really want to collapse things down, this is going to be that same report I just generated here, but it's suppressing the page breaks, and now I'm just listing out these fields instead of showing that full header block for the crop, the variety, the acreage, etc. So again, this is going to be, now we have 3 different chemical combinations with a total of maybe 15 fields on it, and the product total is displayed. So these are kind of the 3 most common, where you've got the detail report, the kind of the partially summarized report, but still having the acreage and the details, versus the fully summarized, very condensed view. So that's kind of a step through the different reporting types on the recommendation piece. And then we will close out here by talking about a combined view. So if I look back at, let's say, this corn report, this is something that would be probably more of a standardized report for, let's say, a cornfield that's just getting a summary check. And you can see I've got a text at the top, I've got a yield estimate, some general health information here with the group question for weeds. But then on the right, you can see I have a linked recommendation, meaning that if I jump over there, I'll see that this field also is accompanied by a recommendation to spray Abound and Drexel. So what you can do from this view, if I jump back into that scouting report, I'm viewing the details here, but now if I generate this PDF, and what I want to make sure to do is if I change this to include the recommendation, I prefer to show this last. But now if I do this, I'll generate a PDF, and this will have the combined scouting report and the recommendation in one view. So you can see here, let's see, I still had the landscape on. So if I jump back on here, put that back to portrait, that should look the way I want now. There we go. So this is probably the most common view that we have. It's if you got your logo, farm dash field information, we break down some of the other details which we auto-populate in the top right. But then as we look through the content here, as far as the summary goes, here's the scouting data, here's your chemical recommendations. And in my case, I had a couple pictures and map notations on this report as well. So this is how you, as a summary, that's how you combine the scouting data and the recommendations into one PDF. And then you can do that across multiple fields. So if I wanted to say I just scouted for a grower, what I can do here is I can break this down, let's say just to my Minnesota farm location. I can select all, push this to a PDF. I can customize that if I want. So in this case, I do want those recs. We'll go back to portrait. And then if I generate that as a PDF, then that's going to have, again, keep in mind that I had 4 different reports here. So as I scroll down here, this is the example I mocked up, but this would be one report, a second report. You can see the field names changing up here, a third report, and a fourth report. So that's kind of the summarized view. None of these had recommendations, so I didn't have it. It's kind of a poor example on my part, but those would be included as well with how I set that up as far as an export. Now, a few last just things I'll mention is that with this, I've been showing how we can generate as a PDF. We also have a share button. So if you're on the app or you're from the web view, you can just click share, and this is going to push that report into an email, and that's going to respect all of the customization options you had set. So this would then send a report. I want to send this out to myself, and then I would get that report with a link via email. So that is another, it respects the customization you had. I won't send that email. And then the other thing that people do find worthwhile is if we're looking at scouting data, let's say I selected all 4 of these fields, we can also export to Excel. And there's fairly simple options here. If I leave this observations as rows off, this is going to generate an Excel file, but it's going to put a tab down here per report. So I can be looking through my reports in Excel in this way, where it looks actually fairly similar to how we pushed it into that the PDF. But the more common way I would say when looking at Excel is it's more often a comparative view, where if you want to grab a month's worth of data, I would recommend putting that as observations as rows, pushing that into Excel, and then what you get is all this data. So the first column is going to be your fields. So you can see that this was that long report I did with lots of checks for, let's say, numeric insect counts. We get a line per observation and 1 line for the average. But then you can see all my fields are stacked up here. So this contains 4 different reports for 4 different fields, but it's all on the same tab. So that's what the export to Excel option looks like. And then the same thing does go for recommendations. If you want to select multiple, and in this case, go observations, go to Excel, you can include the product totals and choose if you want the pricing in there. But now if I push the recommendation to Excel, you can see something fairly similar where you can see I've got multiple lines per, in this case, chemical. So this is a mix that had 2 chemicals in it. This is a mix that had 4 chemicals in it. But as I scroll through here, you can see things like your created by, you would have the completed by. So if you had your applicator that actually filled this out of when they sprayed, you could track who recommended it, who actually sprayed it, the details as far as rates and products go, along with the cost or the price. And then I will also point out that the totals would show up on a second Excel sheet if you wanted those roll-up totals. So that is an output option as well when looking at a program. And with all this, those are all options available to anybody that has the correct access level to write reports. They can also generate those. So basically anybody within our program can use those export options and you can push those to the grower in that way. So I know looks like we're over time here. So I think we will leave it at that. Let me think if I missed anything. If not, we're about to go to questions. So feel free to be putting those in the chat bar and I will definitely be addressing those. So hopefully that was informative. And if you want to review this again, like I said, it will be posted on YouTube. And just a few closing notes here. We do have all of our webinars posted on our website and our YouTube channel. We're looking for updating topics. So if you want us to talk about anything specific, you can email us at info@FarmQA. And with that, we're going to open up to Q&A. And the topic today was on reporting, but if you have any generic questions, I can be addressing those as well. So if you don't want to stick around for questions, I appreciate you joining us today, and please tune in for any future content from us. Thank you.